In this discussion, we will discuss the discussion question of compare direct and indirect expenses. When we see a discussion question or an essay question such as this, our goal typically is to expand on our answer because we're more likely to pick up more points by doing so. In an essay question, expanding on our response typically will allow us an opportunity to pick up more points, to pick up the answer, to pick up what the answer key is looking for, and usually we don't lose points for too much information. And in a discussion question, our goal is to add relevant content to the discussion, and therefore expanding is going to be a necessary component typically to do so. So keeping that in mind, let's go through this again. Compare direct and indirect expenses. So the first thing we might want to do here is once again take a step back and say, well, direct and indirect expenses are things that we typically use in managerial accounting as opposed to the financial accounting, because we're breaking basically the costs up by something other than what we would typically think of in a financial accounting system. For example, the income statement, we typically group the expenses by what they're used for in groups of, say, selling and admin, cost of goods sold. Here, we're grouping things up a bit differently for different roles, different objectives, not the financial statement objective, the financial statement objective being to represent the financial statements for external users to give a good idea of how the company is doing as a whole, but for internal purposes, for managerial purposes, typically being to break up the company in some other ways and relevant ways for us to gather information about usually segments of the company as opposed to the company as a whole, and then seeing whether or not those segments are doing well or poorly, focusing in, of course, on the ones doing poorly and seeing if we can improve on them. So one way we can break up our costs, and we have different ways than in managerial accounting to say, well, how can we break up our costs in different ways to tell us different information about how we can improve? One way to do that is to break things out between direct and indirect expenses. Now, when you think about direct and indirect expenses, again, you're not thinking about the financial statements as a whole. You're thinking about segments, groups of financial statements. We're breaking the company up into segments, and we're trying to see which of these costs are going to be direct with regard to can we assign them to a specific segment and therefore measure the performance of that particular segment based on this cost. So we're going to have the direct costs that are going to be easily assigned to a particular department. And the indirect costs then, by contrast, are not going to be easily assigned to a particular department. And of course, it could be useful to use examples in a question like this. So you might want to list some items that might be direct costs. If we had wages that for people that worked in a particular department, we're pretty certain that their wages are directly applied to that department. Why? Because all their wages, they work only in one department. So there's no question as to which department they work in. If there's supplies that are specific to one department, that is going to be something that we can apply directly to the department. So those are typically easier things to deal with when we think about the departmental accounting, breaking up the performance by department, because they're going to be easier for us to track the direct expenses. The indirect expenses are going to be those items that basically are going to benefit more than one department. They're necessary for the organization as a whole. They benefit more than one department. We have no easy way to say this is exactly where this indirect expense should be allocated. And therefore, we're going to have to use some kind of allocation method to allocate the indirect expenses. And you might want to give some examples of indirect expenses. Things like rent on an entire building where multiple departments are working within the same building is an example of an indirect expense, because the rent is what it is. We're paying it on the company level as a whole, but multiple departments are benefiting from it. So if we want to basically apply the rent to the multiple departments that we're using it for in order to see some allocation of the rent to those departments, then we're going to have to use some kind of allocation method to do so. And we can't just basically take the full how many departments and divide into the rent, because the departments might not be the same size. I mean, we could, but the departments might not be the same size, and so that might not be the best way to do it. So we have to use some allocation ratio typically, and we'll typically be using some type of ratio to apply out those indirect expenses.